deployment of AI in society. And I think that's what we've really been talking about a lot this week, because there's this tendency within AI to focus on the technical, the marvelous innovations that we're making from Silicon Valley and other parts of the world, how we're pushing boundaries and doing things that were unimaginable only 2 years ago. But we spend very little time talking or thinking about how this is going to long-term affect society and how we can do this well. It's funny, I was talking to my co-organizer Peter just a little while ago before we came in here about what the US is doing in policy, and I said, not much really. That's kind of a problem, isn't it? So that's kind of what I want to spend a little time talking about, and bear with me, the topic material is not necessarily the most interesting, but I will try to make it as interesting as I can. We're at a pivotal moment right now where AI does present a huge amount of opportunity, but it also comes with a significant amount of challenges. Policymakers are grappling with this around the world and how to balance the forces, because we always talk about, of course, how can we regulate without over-regulating, right? There's always this propensity to create regulations and then in retrospect say that we've over-regulated and now we've kind of handicapped the industry. And we don't want to do that, right? Because there is really just enormous potential with AI. And we want to take advantage of that. But we want to do so with a certain amount of thoughtfulness. And so regulators are asking that question, and depending on what location, what geography you're in, that's to more or less of a degree true. And the big focus, of course, is how to safeguard while also allowing innovation to continue. So, my big focus today, of course, being very topical that I'm American and I'm here right now in the EU, is I want to look at the United States and the EU as two of the most influential entities in the global AI world, and how each is approaching regulation within the AI space. And while it's tempting to look at the United States and the EU and think of them as opposing and competing views to regulation and how we go about regulating, I think it's also important to take a look at how these can work together. So it's probably fair to say that the US favors a laissez-faire type of approach to regulation in most things. Having been in the world of politics and lobbying, I've seen firsthand just how much money can influence regulations. Big business can influence regulations in the United States. That is not exaggerated. Certainly, I would, as an American individual, I would often say that regulation tends to favor big business, big money over the individual. I think in the EU, you see a very, I would say a very focused concern on individual rights, and you don't really see that as much, at least in my own opinion, within the United States. However, I think the reality is that, again, we're at a point right now where we can still influence how this regulation is going to unfold, and the opportunity for us to make something that's compatible between the United States and the EU so that we can become more of a force for good within the regulation framework that kind of guides the global industry overall. So let's talk a little bit more about the US and what we've done with the AI policy, or maybe better said, what we haven't done with AI policy. It's a fairly accurate statement to say that the US really hasn't chosen a path yet in terms of AI policy. The biggest thing that we've done to this point has been President Biden's executive order. That executive order is, let's say, more of a guideline or a very, very broad framework that doesn't really have a lot of real regulatory teeth to it yet. But the whole point of it is that it's a step forward for us in our comprehensive AI governance. And the order really looks at bringing awareness to AI's potential risks and laying a groundwork for future regulatory efforts. And this is particularly focused on areas of national security, privacy, and safety. That said, much of what's happening in the US remains in flux. And this is often driven by sector-specific regulations and state-level initiatives rather than a unified federal strategy. And if you're familiar with the US regulatory environment, that shouldn't come as a surprise because that's often how it does happen in terms of unfolding. On the other hand, the European Union has definitely made significant strides with the AI Act. And this aims, of course, for a comprehensive regulatory framework across member states. But even here, the picture is more complex than it might first appear. The AI Act, which is certainly more structured than the US approach, incorporates a degree of flexibility. And it's designed to be adaptive, and it recognizes the need for innovation and economic growth alongside the imperative for safety and ethical standards. The real challenge lies, though, not in the existing framework, but in how future regulations will shape or possibly constrain innovation. And that's why I think when we think about the EU and where it's headed regulatory-wise, that should probably be the primary concern, is how do you regulate with common sense in a way that safeguards us as individuals and also allows the industry to be competitive on the world stage. Because, as again, I was talking with Peter this morning, there's a very real risk of creating dual parallel economies where you have the AI industry in the EU and then you have the AI industry everywhere else. And that's something to be avoided because we definitely don't want to disadvantage the EU in a significant way that prevents it from playing a major role within AI. So rather than being on a regulatory collision course, the US and the EU, they face a different kind of challenge, and that's how to cooperate effectively and to learn from each other's approaches. And this is something I think that we've done very poorly in the past, but we do have an opportunity here as AI becomes more prevalent to become better at it. So both regions are definitely exploring how to regulate this evolving field. And there's much to be gained from the mutual exchange here. And whether that's the US adopting some of the EU's comprehensive risk management strategies or the EU integrating more of the US's emphasis on flexibility and market-driven innovation. And I can say that if I look at Biden's executive order and I look at the AI Act, I can definitely see a lot of influence in the executive order that came from how the AI Act was written. And so I can definitely see that there's opportunity there to learn from each other. So, over the next few minutes, I'm going to explore these themes in more detail, examining the US and the EU, where they currently stand, and the implications for these evolving strategies, and how we might find some common ground in crafting global AI governance framework that maximizes the benefits while also minimizing the risk for us. So let's take a closer look at AI policy, or lack thereof, in the United States. So, again, with the AI policy in the United States, it's important to recognize that we don't really have one. We have an executive order. To my knowledge, to date, I'm not aware of, at the state level or the federal level, any particularly comprehensive real legislative or regulatory action that's been taken. Nothing's really been implemented there. So what we are starting to see, though, is a framework in development. There's talks within Congress, and particularly at the Senate level. Our own Senator Chuck Schumer has been holding a series of forums with players in the AI space about how AI policy should look. I am personally not a big fan. I've stated this on the record before. I'm not a big fan of how this has been done. Why? If you take a look at who's at these meetings, it's the big companies of Silicon Valley, it's the billionaires. What do they have to think about when they think about regulations? What are billionaires going to think about?
The host.
Protecting their billions, right? Does that present a conflict? What happens when the only people on the list in these meetings are those people? How is that going to reflect well on our interests as individuals? Probably not, right? So these things are concerning for me. This is why I've been out there in the United States talking to industry groups saying, look, If you don't get in the conversation right now, you're going to be out there in the cold when these regulations pass. And brother, you're not going to be able to roll those back, because regulations that are put in place, they're usually there for the long term, and that is the reality of it. So there's definitely a very limited point of view that the government is taking right now, and I've tried to work from our side. I have contacted Schumer's office, I've contacted some of our other representatives' office to say, if you're having these meetings, we need to be at the table of these meetings. It needs to be the folks who are thinking about the ethics of it, the societal implications of it, and how to responsibly deploy AI within a practical sense. And I don't see any of that happening right now. But we're making our efforts. We're doing what we can with our little voice that we have. Of course, though, as we start to get together and get more voices involved in that, they will start to pay more attention to it. So the bottom line is policy is evolving in the US. Sector-specific regulations are something that we probably will see a little bit more quickly. Oh, of course, it's going to restart. Thank you. And you might actually see that, agencies at the industry level are the ones who are implementing things more quickly than they are at a more comprehensive federal or state level. And so, again, it's an ongoing and evolving conversation. So let's talk about the most important federal effort to date. And of course, that's President Biden's executive order. And coming from the EU, if you're not familiar with the executive orders, I don't really have a very good short explanation of what they are, but think of them as, this is more of a unilateral guideline that has been enacted by any particular, usually it's either going to be the president or a governor of a state who enacts some type of executive order. I'm not a lawyer, nor am I a constitutional scholar, but it comes along the lines that it's a really good idea to do this, but it doesn't necessarily have teeth. However, that said, it does kind of set the stage and the expectation for what should follow in terms of legislation and regulation from other parts of government. So in that light, this order is something of a significant step, and it signals the federal government's recognition of both opportunities and risks associated with AI. And it outlines a series of guidelines and initiatives aimed at promoting the safe and ethical use of AI technologies, and it puts a particular focus on, first, national security, second, privacy, and third, public safety. But as I just described with these executive orders, since they come from one individual, a president, a governor of a state, what's the problem with that? What happens if tomorrow election Kamala Harris wins or Donald Trump wins? What happens to those executive orders? Right. Very, very easy. And I think if you look when Biden took office, many of Trump's executive orders were just basically erased off the books. And that's the same thing that could happen with this type of AI policy. It's not really codified in a way that has longevity to it. So that said, the executive order does emphasize the need for rigorous testing of AI systems, particularly those that are high-risk or dual-use type technologies, which could have implications, especially for national security or the critical infrastructure of the country. And this includes, for example, within healthcare, finance, cybersecurity, and some other areas that you might consider critical. The order mandates the development of AI test beds within government agencies and controlled environments where AI technologies can be rigorously tested and evaluated before they're deployed on larger scales. And this approach reflects a cautious optimism about AI's potential, and it's paired with a clear acknowledgement for the need of robust safeguards. But again, it lacks a lot of teeth. And it's funny because if I talk about, the gist of this order, it very much does sound like they kind of looked at the AI Act from the EU and said, well, this is a good idea, let's use this, and this. So definitely there was a lot of influence we could see that came from the EU side. And what's most important to remember, though, is that this is one small piece of the puzzle as well. And the US, again, we haven't really done anything comprehensive. We haven't done anything nationwide that would be constituted as an AI regulatory framework. And it is quickly evolving, but it's still evolving. And of course, one of the things with the government at any level is that they'll be passing AI regulations for AI technologies that were relevant 2 years ago, 5 years from now. And so by the time they do actually start enacting things, they may be well outdated. I think the US ambassador, when he was here on Monday, he talked about John Kerry crafting some legislation that regulated the dial-up industry when the industry had already moved beyond dial-up and they weren't even using it anymore. So that is a very real reality of dealing with government regulations as well. But there's some efforts, I would say, at the state level too. California, of course, is notable because they have seen deficiencies within AI national policy and often undertaken it at the state policy level to be able to address those. One of the examples is privacy regulations. The US lacks any type of real nationwide privacy type approach, but the states, on the other hand, have created something to fill those gaps. And so we are starting to see that a little bit. But again, nothing really has been implemented. So at the agency level, what we might consider real regulations, the agencies have also been coming up with a set of guidelines and what will ultimately probably turn into regulations. We're starting to see this at the Federal Trade Commission level, and we're also starting to see a certain amount of dialogue happening between these agencies and the private sector. For example, warnings to companies about the risks involved with deploying AI and practices that they should be avoiding to stay out of the crosshairs of the government. So this has really been seen in areas particularly around advertising, hiring, and credit scoring, for example. Those are things where we are starting to see the FTC make strides right now and in its efforts with the private sector to warn them that regulations are going to be coming. So in addition to the regulatory efforts, the US has seen significant AI activity around AI policy in the form of public-private partnerships and industry-led initiatives. So you are starting to see, for example, from the National Institute of Standards and Technology, that they've been working closely with industry stakeholders to develop voluntary AI risk management frameworks. And this might be better thought of as industry self-regulation. I think the ambassador also mentioned that he was a fan of industry self-regulation. I too am a fan of industry self-regulation when it works. Unfortunately, you often run into the scenario where industry is very, very eager to self-regulate, but then they actually will create a very more favorable environment for themselves. And so self-regulation, when it works, is a good way to approach it. Sometimes it is very much lopsided and favors industry in a way that just basically allows them to do what they want. So despite these efforts, though, the US remains highly decentralized and when it comes to AI, and it also remains highly reactive. So they are driven by specific needs, which is why you are starting to see industry-level things emerge before you're starting to see a broader framework across federal or state-level governments. And this has definitely led to concerns about the potential for uneven enforcement and the regulatory gaps which will ultimately emerge from this. And this is especially around areas like privacy and data security, where the federal level will struggle to keep pace with what's happening in the industry. If you asked me 2 years ago when the first LLM started to become public, like ChatGPT 2 and so on, I would have said in 5 years from now, we'll actually be where we are today. That's how quickly it's evolved. Oops. The reality is it is evolving so quickly that it will be very difficult. In the best of times, it's hard for government to keep up with technological progress. And AI has only exacerbated that more and kind of made bare the deficiencies that the government is going to have when trying to regulate. So, bottom line is that the US is still trying to find its way when it comes to AI governance. And there's a strong emphasis on maintaining the let's say, an environment that fosters innovation. And I think that's one that, we've heard this. I've been hearing this since the advent of the internet, essentially. Back when we were talking about cryptography, back when we were talking about e-commerce, back when all of these things were coming to the forefront in the mid-90s. I started hearing about, let's not overregulate, let's take a hands-off approach, let's make sure that we allow the industry to innovate. And to some degree, I think that's been a very successful strategy. But on the other hand, we have a situation now where there's very little protection for the individual in terms of privacy, consumer rights, and so on. I don't know how often this happens in the EU, but it almost seems like every week now I get an email that my private data has been breached due to some hack of a company. And there's no recourse at all for myself as the consumer. And the reality is that is oftentimes because of this hesitancy by the government to penalize companies, even when it is clearly an act of negligence that resulted in that type of data breach. I had a situation where about 12 years ago, I used to write regularly for Yahoo. Back when Yahoo was actually relevant, they used to publish news articles, and I used to write articles for them on technology. So in order to pay me, they had all of my private information. And my private information was breached in a data hack, and the reason was because they did not hash their passwords on their server, right? That's like first year computer science level stuff right there, right? And yet there was no recourse, despite the obvious negligence there. And that, again, is a side effect of also this hesitancy, this reverence towards innovation at any cost and not interfering with the private sector and to not penalize them. So that's kind of the reality of that. So the next few years will be critical in determining how the US shapes its AI policy. And we'll start to see a move towards, hopefully, a more comprehensive federal framework, or maybe just the current patchwork approach will be what persists. So the one thing that I can see possibly is the US might be more influenced by, for example, the leadership we see from the EU within the policy side, even if it is a watered down version, for example, of what the EU is implementing. But let's take a look, actually, speaking of the EU, now let's take a look at what really the EU has been focused on here. So, obviously the first thing is the EU is quite different in its regulatory approach than the United States is. And it's also still something that's complex and evolving. And the reality is that it's going to continue evolving, of course, right? The AI Act is in place now, but it's nothing but a first step, right? So the AI Act is the EU's most significant step to date, and it was passed, of course, quite recently. And this legislation is aimed at creating more of a framework than anything when it comes down to it across all EU member states. And it sets some clear rules and standards for the development and the deployment of AI systems. Now, at first glance, the AI Act might appear to be highly restrictive and a rigid regulatory framework, but I think on a closer inspection, you'll find that the AI Act has quite a bit of flexibility in it, and it's designed to foster innovation, will ensure safety, and I think a certain degree of ethical compliance for things that are done here in the EU. And the AI Act is notable in the way that it introduces a risk-based approach to AI regulation, which is one of its most distinguishing features. The AI systems are categorized into 4 risk levels: the minimal, limited, high, and unacceptable. And each category comes with its own set of requirements, with the most stringent regulations applied to these high-risk systems, as they should be. And these include the AI applications like in areas like healthcare, transportation, critical infrastructure sectors. Doesn't that sound familiar? Like we might have borrowed that for an executive order? But as it should be, probably, right? This is what we should be. And I think that's a really good approach to it, by classifying and categorizing the risk levels like that. So, I talked about, and I've said it many times so far this week, common sense regulatory approach. I think the AI Act does take a fairly common sense approach to it. And so, for high-risk systems, for example, the AI Act mandates comprehensive measures including rigorous risk management frameworks, transparency obligations, and mandatory human oversight. So all good things. Again, all very common sense. I wouldn't consider them overly restrictive at this point. And these systems have to undergo conformity assessments before they can be deployed. Developers are required to maintain detailed documentation and accountability, and this approach really hopefully will mitigate risks associated with still allowing for the deployment of AI systems that are innovative and can deal still with sensitive and critical areas where the potential benefits can actually be significant. So, that I think is a very good approach so far. And one of the most forward-looking areas of the AI Act is its regulation of foundation models. So these large, versatile AI systems that serve as the building blocks for various AI applications. Recognizing the transformative potential of these models, the EU has implemented specific provisions to ensure safe and ethical use. Foundation models, they need to undergo extensive testing and continuous monitoring to ensure they meet safety standards. And if you think about it, the way that it lays that out, it almost sounds like, how many people here are familiar with ISO certification, right? It almost kind of sounds like that approach. You're documenting, you're verifying, you're going through and auditing. And so it really does make sense to approach it like this. And I would really like to see the United States codify some of this in what started with the executive order, and I'd like to see some of this approach more formalized within our particular regulatory framework. So let's move on to a little bit more talk about the flexibility of this. So despite these stringent requirements, and I use stringent quite lightly here actually because I really don't see them as that imposing, but despite the stringent requirements for these high-risk systems, the AI Act also provides a degree of flexibility. So for example, the Act includes provisions for regulatory sandboxes. These are controlled environments where companies can test innovative AI systems under the supervision of regulators. And these sandboxes allow for experimentation and innovation while ensuring that any risks are carefully managed. This approach is intended to strike a balance between fostering technological advancements and protecting public interests. And of course, the AI Act also emphasizes the importance of privacy and data protection. And this builds on the GDPR. And AI systems that process personal data must adhere to strict privacy standards, ensuring that individuals' rights are protected. So this is particularly relevant in areas, for example, of facial recognition and biometric data processing, where the potential for misuse is high. And the integration of GDPR protections into the AI Act demonstrates the EU's commitment to safeguarding privacy in the age of AI. And it's important, I think, to kind of think about the implications of privacy, data privacy within AI, because I believe what we're going to find in the near future is, if it's not already the case, is that data will become more and more valuable, particularly as AI systems continue to learn and be trained. It's funny it mentioned facial recognition, because that's one of the areas that not only have I seen it misused, but I've also seen some of the most questionable practices come about from facial recognition. And so that's just the tip of the iceberg, right? The tip of the proverbial iceberg right now. As AI systems become more complex and robust and capable, we're going to find even more use cases that potentially are open and ripe for abuse. So while the AI Act provides a robust regulatory framework, it also recognizes the needs for ongoing adaptation and evolution. And the legislation included mechanisms for periodic review and adjustment, and it ensures that it keeps pace with the rapid advancement in AI technology. So this was a pretty forward-looking approach, and it was critical because AI systems will continue to evolve in ways that are going to be quite difficult to predict. The EU has also been proactive in engaging with stakeholders across the globe, seeking to harmonize its regulations with international standards and encouraging dialogue. So, the thing that always comes up is the potential risk towards innovation. And I think this is particularly true for smaller companies and startups that may lack the resources to comply with these standards. And of course, that always becomes an issue. And it's funny because I was talking, a little earlier about how the U.S. Congress has been talking to folks in the AI side, talking about how they should regulate, what's a good approach. And Sam Altman, everyone knows Sam Altman, CEO of OpenAI. He got up there and he started to testify before Congress, and he said, I think, and I'm going to paraphrase him here, but I think large language model companies should be licensed. You can't develop large language models without a license. On the surface, well, okay, that sounds reasonable. If we think about it from a cynical point of view, though, what does it mean? Right? Yeah, that's right. We're going to stifle competition. Only if you can afford a license will you be able to get into the LLM space. So we have to be careful. Sometimes on the surface, something might sound great, but as we think about the implications more, it really is, quite a cynical approach to it. But that's always something that we need to be concerned about, is that we box out potential startups. And typically, these great strides within innovation are often driven by these really small startups. Two people, again, the metaphorical two people in a garage, right, creating a startup. So we have to be sure that we do provide avenues for these type of organizations to continue to innovate despite having very limited resources. So the EU's acknowledged some of these concerns, and they've included measures to support these small to medium-sized enterprises. There's simplified compliance procedures, and they have access to funding for innovation. And this, of course, where the rubber meets the road, implementation. So despite the AI Act having all of these provisions in place, as many of you there will know, once you start to deal with the government, it's actually the implementation. When you start to encounter the bureaucracy, whether or not we can actually make this happen on a practical level, that will be the real question. And it's so early on now. We're not to the point where we can really see what's happening with the AI Act to any great degree, since it's really just become effective. But this is definitely in contrast to the more ad hoc and sector-specific approach to the US and almost the non-existent policies of some other countries. And again, hearkening back to the US ambassador, countries that I refuse to name, but we all know who they are. So when it comes down to it, I think if we had to look at, in terms of progress and regulation, you've got the EU, you've got the US, and you have a lot of other countries that just aren't really thinking about regulation and safeguarding quite yet. They may get there, they may have no interest in getting there, we'll see. But as the EU moves forward in continuing to implement the AI Act, it will be critical to monitor how these regulations are applied in practice and whether they're achieving their goals in terms of fostering innovation. And of course, whether or not they're protecting the public interest. So the EU's approach can probably serve as a good model, or it can serve as a warning for other regions that they develop their own. So my ideal situation is that we can see what the EU's been doing, and we can kind of take all the best practices away, and it can help inform us when it comes to our policy development as well. So that said, let's talk about flexibility and structure and cooperation. So far we've talked about the approaches within the US and the EU about regulating AI. And what's become clear is that the two regions, they're not just charting separate paths, they're creating opportunities where we can learn from each other and we can collaborate on a global scale. And I think that's important because what we do, think about it collectively, the EU, the US, if we can find a lot of common ground and best practices, the rest of the world will kind of have to fall in line to a certain degree to be able to do business with us. And so that will be a very compelling factor. Again, we're not going to get all the bad actors on board, but we can probably get most of the good actors on board. And so that becomes a very compelling factor within the overall global development of AI. I think one of the most important things we can do when it comes to cooperation, or first steps in cooperation, is the mutual learning that we can do. This is a great example of that potential for mutual learning here. And of course, this is a very closed group. We all come from a very specific background in a very specific area, but it's a start, right? The fact that we had 4 ambassadors and a minister here on Monday was very encouraging. It showed that there was definitely some interest in what we were doing, and it showed there was a willingness to listen and to hopefully learn. And so this is a good example of that ability for us to start the dialogue. And by the way, not to plug this for next year, but this is the first of an ongoing series of conferences. So we do hope to see you back again next year, and hopefully it will be an even bigger conference by then. But that said, that's kind of, I think, the most important thing we can do to start with. We can take examples again from the AI Act. We can start to learn best practices. We can start to see things that maybe aren't working as well as they were hoped. And then how can we adjust that and start to normalize that into what becomes essentially the global norms of AI policy. With any luck, the US will remain normal politically over the next several years, and we'll be able to have something of a, I would say, something of a uniform policy start to emerge and become less political. I think at this point, fortunately, unlike many things in the United States, AI policy is still fairly neutral politically. It's one of the things that, whether you're a Republican or you're a Democrat or you're an independent, you can sort of agree that AI presents some potential challenges and we need to confront them. The problem becomes in the US, in my observation of it, when companies start to throw money at an issue and they start to lean into one political spectrum or the other. The fact, and not knowing anyone's political leaning out there, the fact that we can even debate whether climate change is real or not speaks to the power of big money and lobbying. It's bizarre. I think everyone in here leans towards the sign of science, considering what we do for work. The idea that you could have something that's empirically proven and yet rejected out of hand because of your belief is just mind-blowing, but it does tell you how much influence can happen when something gets polarized and it's generally driven by big money lobbying. We're not there yet with AI. We could be there. I may be back here next year talking about how polarizing it is and it's crazy, but we're not. So hopefully we can continue to get some things into place before that has the opportunity to happen as well. So by exchanging these type of best practices, I think we can really learn from each other's approaches. And for example, let's say the EU discovers later on that the AI Act doesn't have the flexibility it needs. Hopefully, maybe they can turn to the US and say, okay, this is working in the US, this isn't working, let's adopt some good best practices from there, and we can do the same and so on. And those will become crucial drivers in our ability to innovate and continue to see this sector evolve. Another critical area for cooperation is the development of international standards and frameworks. And it's funny because that US ambassador was kind of sharp, actually. I was surprised for a politician. But that said, he made some good points also about the idea of having international standards bodies. I do think that that is a very good area to approach things from. In my mind, it's slightly better than industry self-regulation. If we look at international standards organizations, for example, like UL, those generally tend to work well. As a consumer, if I pick up an electrical device that doesn't have the UL certification, I'm likely not going to buy it, right? I'm not going to risk burning my house down because of a poorly put together piece of electrical, appliance. So there is that opportunity as well, so that we can look at creating some type of international standards. ISO, for example, IEEE, these are some other organizations that may serve a sort of blueprint for how we can go about creating an international standards organization for AI. And that may fill the gap or may completely replace what is lacking within national policies and international policies. So the harmonization there doesn't necessarily mean uniformity, but rather it ensures that these frameworks can coexist with each other. They can act, again, as guides to kind of tie together various AI policies across various regions and countries. And it will help us work towards the overall AI regulatory approach in areas particularly that align with things like data protection, cybersecurity, and the ethical use of AI, which are probably some of the areas we're more interested in addressing. And it could also help us in terms of aligning definitions, compliance requirements, and enforcement mechanisms when it comes down to it. So there's a few areas there that we can potentially lean on in terms of international standards. How are we doing on time, by the way? Oh my God, we're out of time. Sorry, I went on long. Let's skip a little forward. All right. So as we consider the future for AI governance, it's clear that the EU and the US aren't necessarily on a collision course with each other, but rather on, hopefully, a journey for deeper cooperation. By learning from each other, harmonizing our approaches, and collaborating on research and standards, these two regions can lead the way to creating a global AI governance framework that fosters innovation and also protects the values that we hold dear.
I'm sorry, we have time up to 12:30.
Oh, do what?
So you're about an hour.
I thought it was only 45 minutes.
Yeah. It says 12 to 12:30.
Oh, I think isn't that supposed to go to lunch? Because that was only 45 minutes for that.
The lunch is 12:30 until 1:30.
Interesting. I was not prepared to speak like an hour and a half either.
It's up to you. You can do whatever you want.
I'm gonna stop after this slide and take Q&A because usually,
Perfect.
yeah, definitely an hour and a half would have been a long talk, wasn't it? I'm tired standing around here, yeah. But so this cooperation obviously isn't just desirable, but it's essential. So AI has obvious potential to affect every aspect of our lives. And it's really up to us to ensure that this transformation is for the better. As we move forward with this, the US and the EU, we do have an opportunity and we have a responsibility to lead by example. And so through that, we can show the world how to better harness this AI power in a way that's both innovative and ethical. So sorry for the false alarm of almost going over time. I don't think you want to hear me talk about policy for an hour and a half, but I'm happy to take some questions if there's anything I can answer. I'll wait for it. We don't have those little softbox mics. We can just toss those up there, right? Those are pretty cool. I went Nazareth to get those. Hi, Joe. Thank you for videoing this.
Sorry, the mic is not working. So
I think this one is
let's check another one.
I think that one is charged.
And there's actually a switch inside if you unscrew.
It's not very user friendly.
Yeah,
It's not.
retro.
It's not.
I agree. I'll go with Okay, this is ready. So who was first? Yes, please.
Thank you for the very optimistic talk. I completely agree that global consensus, or at least consensus between EU and US, is necessary to regulate AI. But I'm a bit concerned regarding the speed of establishing conventional rules of governance in the EU or even in a global setting. So could you comment on what you think about the speed of global consensus on regulation and the speed of development and AI, how they fit together?
Sure. And I think that's a great point. It's something that, it's not unique to AI. We've struggled with it in many other areas too, right? If we go back to the internet, as it was starting to unfold and how we should treat the regulation of that, we experienced similar things, although it wasn't unfolding nearly as quickly as it is with artificial intelligence. Given that, I'm a big fan of the framework approach, where we create broader guidelines, and the details or the more very specific granular areas, we either leave that to agencies with something of a more flexible approach, like the EU has done to an extent with the AI Act, where they can go back and review things that they think aren't working and then adjust those. I kind of really like that approach, particularly in an area that, let's be fair, 2 years ago, I didn't think we would be here. I thought, again, like I said earlier, I thought it was going to be 5 years from now until we saw this. And I'm not alone in that. I've talked to many people in the field, and a lot of us are amazed. And even those of us, in this room who are at the forefront of AI, it's like drinking from a fire hose sometimes, trying to stay on top of it. Imagine the politician who really, this is not their specialty. They're dealing with probably hundreds of other issues that need to be thought of, so it's not their main focus either. You're going to get very poor outcomes if we try to regulate so granularly on topics that will be, by the time that legislation passes, will already be irrelevant. And so the framework approach, like the AI Act, to a degree, Biden's executive order, again, executive order lacking real teeth. The framework approach probably has the best potential to actually be effective. And that's why I think the AI Act is the step in the right direction. I do like a lot of the provisions written in there to allow for flexibility and revision as needed. The reality, though, is I think even more important than crafting the legislation is figuring out how to implement it in a practical way, because once we hit the gears of bureaucracy, that's where usually things fall apart, right? Acts written with the best intent, often implemented with the worst capability. And it only seems to get worse the further down the bureaucracy that you go. And so that's what I would be more concerned about, is implementation of it.
Thank you. Thanks for the excellent talk. Yeah, we discussed this probably before the.
Yeah, we had a pre-game session.
Yeah,
right?
exactly. I think. Is it being recorded? I have to be careful what kind of words I'm going to use.
No vulgarities.
It's just, no, not the vulgarities. Just there's a significant group in Europe as well who are very critical toward the EU AI Act, because, to be honest, it's been also influenced by the various lobbying groups. One of the strongest criticism is that, from the ethical point of view, the most widespread sort of normative system is the human rights approach, and neither the European nor the American or the Chinese obviously picked up this as a framework. The Canadians are toying with this idea. So I think, just to answer also your question, there will be various emphases on whether it's a laissez-faire or other type of approach, framework approach. Mm-hmm. What I would like to reflect on the slides, some of first the standardization, and I'm not a big believer in self-regulation. We can see that it's not working.
Right, in theory, right, but then practical.
Yeah, yes, that's the hope of the American policymakers. But we've seen it, for example, with drones. It's not working. The regulator had to step in. Especially, I think the good example is Germany, where it is heavily regulated. And when we were doing research in the Netherlands, we've seen German colleagues on the border coming over to the Netherlands, do their research, and they went back to Germany. So it's an interesting setup. So there are limits to the self-regulation. However, the standardization is a very important point, which I'm grateful that you mentioned that. Why? Because reflecting on the U.S. ambassador's remarks, he's coming from telecommunications. The 5G, 6G standardization is heavily in the hands of the Chinese, and they're now dictating the various standards. And it's now considered a very sensitive topic from a national cybersecurity perspective, where we try to push back. And AI, if you look at the amount of publications, research publications, the Chinese researchers are leading that. So, you can see the trend. And that's something which I want to go towards, and sorry for the long comment, the research. We need to do research together across the Atlantic more with each other, and that's why I would like to see more also and make a plea for this in this group. We need to do that more to be able to also influence the standards and the regulation consequently. Thank you.
Yeah, fully agreed. And I, a couple interesting points. Self-regulation, yeah, on paper it sounds good, but in reality, the execution, oftentimes lacking. I am a big believer in global standards organizations. The only thing that I'm a little wary about with organizations in that space is that occasionally it feels to me it's more of a money grab to say that you're standardized, and the organizations are like, okay, we'll go through this entire process as long as you have enough money to pay for it, and we'll, give you that certification. So we have to make sure that, and that's not every organization. For example, I think IEEE is a great organization that does great work, and they produce great research. And if we could see something like that in the AI space, I would be very happy. It just, when we approach the global standards body approach, we need to think mindfully about how we can avoid let's just check all the boxes and get that standardization so I can put it up on the wall and show customers I have it, right? That, I don't want to pick on ISO, but I feel like ISO 9001 pretty much, I get that impression. It's like, oh, you went through the motions, right? You got it, good for you. But it becomes one of those things like if you want to do business with certain entities, you have to have ISO certification, right? And I wonder how meaningful it is, because I've been through a few ISO certifications myself, and I found that as long as you make sure you have enough paperwork, you're usually good to go, right? What does it actually practically mean, though, is another question. So there's that. So when we do approach it, I think we should be very, very mindful about avoiding those pitfalls and model it a little bit more like IEEE does or UL does or others. When we think about research, you have a very good point too, and I think that's why we need to be very proactive as an international community here in our research approach. We can't let any one voice dominate the research circle, right? Because for a few reasons. One is that oftentimes research gets disseminated to the public in little snippets of research, right? We've all read the newspaper article that says, new research paper proves XYZ. Any empirical researcher in this room knows that one paper does never prove anything, right? And no self-described scientist would ever say something proved something. We very much support it. But that's the idea, right? That's how the public receives it and digests it. And politicians are the same, because politicians typically have some intern in their office and they're compiling this particular little two-piece summary on this particular topic that the politician's going to read before casting a vote or not. And it's going to come from some mass media source that's 3 sources removed from the original research. Who knows if it came out of Beijing, right? Who knows whether it was funded by the North Korean government or whoever, to kind of take a little bit of a hyperbolic approach. But that's the reality, right? They're getting this 3 sources removed from us. They're not reading all of the limitations of the research and suggestions for future research. They're not going in there and understanding what the demographic breakdown was of the sample. It's things like that. So we need to make sure that we are playing a bigger proactive role as an international community and making sure that we have equal representation, particularly as this is evolving very quickly, right? Presents a different challenge with research because it is evolving so quickly. So I've been doing actually some research, some empirical research on this recently in terms of how AI can help facilitate international communications in real time. The problem was when I started doing the research, there was like 2 pre-publication papers on it. Now there's like 10 published, right? So it's a game of catch up for me too, to even be able to do real meaningful research on it. So we need to keep that in mind, but that doesn't mean that it gives us a free pass to say, okay, we're gonna wait until the body develops further and we have a lot more research to kind of go with. We need to be very much at the forefront. And the fact that you guys are all here this week makes me very encouraged, and to use your word, optimistic, that we're on the right track. We're in the right mindset. We're ready to lead the way when it comes to informing the world ethical approaches and how society will be most impacted by this. Yes?
I'm Christoph from Vienna, Austria, And as a marketing person, I ask myself, and following that and your presentation and the entire discussion, I ask myself how the huge distance between what we are thinking here, what politicians are doing, what all the regulations are about, and on the other side, what the populations are concerned about. The huge distance, how that can be minimized, how we can transport what we are doing here to the population of our countries. I know that's a question where you may tell me I, as a marketing person, should answer the question, but it simply makes me think and I don't have the answer. That's why I would be interested in getting some other perspectives on that.
Certainly, my opinion would be, if I could ask by hands, how many of you here come from a technical discipline? How many of you come from a social science side? Humanities? So everyone put hands up at some point when I asked that, right? What we're doing here is a very interdisciplinary approach to this, and I think that's really what we need to do, because there's a tendency in academia, I'm sure you all know, to silo yourselves, right? The true interdisciplinary academic is a thing of the past these days. Specialization is what makes the dollars, right? Gets the publications. So working together in a very interdisciplinary type approach is probably going to get better results and help us disseminate it across a broader spectrum of society. I think there's also a tendency within academia, which by rights it should be like this, but that is that we're very precise and very refined in how we communicate things. And we need to be, by the nature of what we do. We want to make sure our findings are presented accurately in the way that, you know, they can't be misinterpreted. Unfortunately, the general public doesn't really think like that. So sometimes we need to make sure that we're disseminating a message for broader audiences that's more digestible. After the first day's talk, someone came up to me, and this isn't actually the first time this has happened, and they said, you know, I was very impressed by your ability to bring across complex technical topics in a way that's easy to understand for a layperson. And that's kind of how we need to think about it when we are talking. We can still be precise and we can still make sure we avoid ambiguity, but we need to make sure that we're not putting on the elitist academic tones with the general public too, because we're not going to find very much buy-in and amongst general populations if we don't try to connect with them a little bit better. And I think that's something that we have a lot of room for improvement for in the academy, is making sure that the public is better informed and countering the voices that have specific interests in mind. You know, I think about lobbying, and again, it blows my mind that, you know, I think you mentioned individual rights. The fact that anyone would forego their own individual interests to say, you know what, oil companies need to be protected, that is just mind-blowing to me. Really? Really? But people do, right? We don't need to go far. It's not even just in America. I mean, what do they have? The trucker convoy up in Canada? Was that a year or two ago? Who are they fighting for? Big corporations, oil companies, other mass industrial complexes that don't care what happens to them. But still, with the right messaging, these lobbying voices can gain that type of influence and support among people who really, they oppose their interests. So I think we need to do a very good job of trying to counter that as well, with knowledge, with fact, and being able to get society buy-in. Yes? Oh, Nevin? Or?
I have a question.
Who's that?
I already.
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks for the talk. Just I have another question, but continue on your question. Because I also work at the community college of Vienna, and I think it's a very good point that we really need to approach the public. I also do science communication on Instagram, for example, and I think the youth is a good example that they use it a lot, technology, but like the real knowledge about it is not that high. So I think we really need to go outside of the academic circles to approach people in public spaces, in community colleges, on social media. I think it's a very important point, and as you said, we have to try to break it down so everyone can understand this. But yeah, this is an important point. But my question would be, what do you think, would it be, is there a difference in the outcome of the presidential election? So for example, if Kamala Harris wins, maybe she will limit the influence of big tech, or would it be a difference in the policy of the AI and policies?
So that is the million-dollar question, isn't it? I think at this point, at least my observation of it is that there's very little difference right now on either side politically of how they're viewing AI. They both want to see it developed. They want to see innovation. They want to see the U.S. lead the way. Obviously, there's a certain nationalistic sentiment that they want the U.S. to be USA, right? Number one. So that exists, and I think it exists pretty much equally across the spectrum. When you start to get to push and shove when it comes to implementing regulations that protect more consumer rights, if I had to bet, I would bet that you'll start to see lobbying dollars flow to the Republican side to protect the interests of business as opposed to consumer rights. That's how I've seen it with other areas of technology. That's not to say the Democrat side won't also be susceptible to that, because oftentimes I find that they're just as equally likely to take donations and campaign contributions as the Republicans are. They may form their messaging better to sound like they're protecting the consumer side, but I think both sides are equally susceptible to it, maybe the Republican side a bit more. However, we really haven't seen much of a push yet, so that is why I feel like right now the sentiment is roughly equal across both sides of the spectrum.
This is Walter, also from Austria. I was wondering, you mentioned before, we need international standardization. And I thought, what's your opinion? Do we need digital human rights? Because that would be like the highest level. And in my opinion, certain countries probably wouldn't care because they don't care about the regular human rights. But still in the West, nobody really likes to be called in violation of human rights. So do you think that might improve the situation somewhat?
I certainly think that's a very novel way to think about it, and captioning it as digital human rights is, it's not too far-fetched, right? Because we're in an era now where for the last 20 years, it has become essential almost to our being, to the way that we interact in life, to our ability to even make a living, for example. A lot of people work remotely, a lot of people work within the digital economy. So it is something that's become more and more key and central to our own lives. I don't think it's a bad idea. I think gaining consensus as to what constitutes digital human rights would be the bigger debate among different parties. Certainly, if we had to think about it, again, I kind of put America right there in the middle of that spectrum. Europe is probably more on the higher end. Bad actors, obviously, they don't care about regular human rights, so why would they care about digital human rights? The idea that we could gain consensus on that will probably be the bigger challenge, right? I don't think it's a bad idea. I just think it's something that maybe if we started the conversation now, 2 generations from now, we might actually start to see some real traction within that space. So I don't think it's a bad idea at all, honestly. Yes.
Jeffrey, I have a question that's related to what Walter and Peter have both hinted at and asked about. But with the example of China, for example, they're already using AI for creating the social credit scores that people have, and for regulation of social mobility through society in ways that more democratic societies would see as incredibly negative. So with that in mind, all the talk about collaboration between the US, the EU, and in a way, what does it matter if there are these other state actors, and particularly autocratic state actors, including Russia, that might completely ignore attempts to put democratizing, human rights safeguarding acts in place? It seems like an impossible dance in a way.
Probably the biggest influence we could have by standardizing at least a broad framework across democratic countries is that, just like you see within the GSM space or 5G space, where we refuse to, for example, use Chinese technology within certain critical infrastructure, you could probably find the same thing to be true within the AI space. We refuse to use systems that don't adhere to the standards that have been established. That would be one way, and what you end up with is a very either domestic or at best a bloc-oriented type system. So Russia, China, North Korea, whoever use these systems and they're kind of doing their own thing, and the rest of the world is using things that are more compliant with what we consider to be acceptable practices. That would be one way. It would have a limiting effect or a containing effect. Of course, that would result in two parallel development branches, right? It would be ideal not to have that, but it may be the necessity. Because there is a certain, there's definitely the influence that we're between the US and the EU, and bring Canada into the mix and some other countries, we're fairly sizable and influential economic power. And to not do business with us is a huge disadvantage. And so that may be enough to at least, I would say, incline other countries towards compliance. That would be my guess at this point. Any other questions? We good? Are we tired of talking about policy? No? Yes, Fresh.
Yeah. If I may add in a discussion, I don't have a question, but discussion about human rights in digital world. There is a special group in the United Nations which is working on that. They also release a report on that. OECD has also developed some guideline about digital world and how to do, and in European Union, every act, including AI or cybersecurity, the humanity is at center. So even if you ask ChatGPT that what about humanity in Cyber Act of EU, you will find all the details. The other thing, Jeffrey, you mentioned about, for example, cooperation between US and EU, right? So EU has actually a special committee in CEN. So if you were in the morning, the lady, she was here, she is the chair of working group, which is actually a committee between ISO and EU CEN. So they are developing together. So you say replication, it's called Vienna Agreement. And then there is another German agreement, which is Dresden. We had a meeting there. And that agreement is going to continue having this more cooperation. And idea is to bring everything into ISO and IEC, because Europe is following IEC, while at world level, ISO is widely used. So there is a lot of development. Even in the act, before EU is putting act into the practice, the politician it's a bottom-up approach from us, because all the Horizon and other projects, we are giving policy pilot input, and then this politician is building act. And this act, once its draft is ready, it's available to public to comment. Right? So there is a good process. Unfortunately, I think Ambassador Adam says, communication is a challenge. So we, even as an educator, we have a less awareness about these processes. When I get involved before 5 years, I was really surprised at how structurally they have done it. The only challenge, I think even the professor in the morning says from the commission, that implementation is a challenge.
Right, exactly.
My side person, yeah, thank you.
And wow, here I was insulting ISO and no one told me. But yeah, I fully agree. And there's cooperation at many levels too, and standardization at many levels. And I think that we need to be thinking towards a very comprehensive, holistic approach to it, because there is going to be a lot of challenges, and again, it's going to impact many varied areas, right?
And this kind of cooperation between us, it's really a fruitful chance for us to learn, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And I think we're on the right track, and this is very early on. We're, if not the first conference on this topic, among the first conference on this topic, right?
Yeah.
And we're starting to now, I can't imagine we come back a year from now and talk about this, how much things will have changed, hopefully for the good, potentially for the bad, but we're actually starting to have these conversations now and think about these things. And I'm sure from the people that you've met over the last 3 days, you'll start to come up with ideas and brainstorm and be like, hey, let's collaborate on research here, or let's have conversations there, or let's set up a working group over here. And it kind of synergizes a lot of what we hope to accomplish. And beyond what you're hearing here, what you're listening to over these days of talks, it's also the relationships you're developing that are going to be able to propel you to further actions and to be able to make change for good. Yes?
Thank you. Actually, my question is out of curiosity. And I would like to ask, when we make references to bad actors and good actors, in quote, or friendly foes or not so friendly foes, as the case may be, I would like to know what are the efforts, for example, when we talk about collaborations and the policies we make across board from the US to the EU, how do we carry along these not so friendly foes, for example, the bad actors, as they sometimes are referenced? Does it mean that they don't have some best practices sometimes that can be examples, like in our partnerships or in our development of partnerships, and things that we can use to shape also some policies done by the so-called good actors, as the case may be? I would like to know that, because in the landscape, there seems to be no reference from these areas. I don't know if you get my question.
I think I do, and I think you're absolutely right, because if we look at our efforts in the past to gain compliance by those we would consider bad actors, the first thing I think of is nuclear non-proliferation, where we tried the same old tactics over and over again. Hey, we'll give you some subsidies and you can build nuclear power plants, but you're going to agree not to build weapons of mass destruction. How well has that gone so far, right? I think that there's a little bit of a difference in the AI space, being tech generally, right? And we have seen this to a degree. Telecom is a good example, because the exclusion of Chinese 5G companies from the mix of most of the West critical infrastructure has definitely impacted their industry in a way that has made it, Peter mentioned that they were a big voice within GSM, right? But at the same time, until they get their act together, they're never going to be within critical infrastructure here in the West. And so that has really hampered their efforts. And I think companies like ZTE, Huawei, they're feeling where they were, the mid-2010s were on top of the world. Now they're feeling very much relegated to domestic entity status. And that is starting to show, I think, some positive results. AI probably has the potential to take that blueprint a little bit and adjust it as needed. But when you're talking probably, just throw a number out here, 2/3 of the world's economy is not going to use your systems, that's a very compelling factor. It does compel you to toe the social acceptable line. And so, unlike previous efforts with bad actors, which honestly I feel like they've been really terrible, the tech side has shown a little bit more promise and compelling, and it's because of the economic interest aspects of it that don't really exist. When you talk about, hey, don't develop nuclear weapons, there's very little economic impetus for me not to do that, particularly with autocracies and dictatorships that are most interested in staying in power. That's their primary goal. There's actually more of an interest for me to go ahead and develop as much protection for the regime as I can. On the economic side, there's, with IT, with tech, there's less of that motivation and more of a motivation to make more money from it. And so the capitalistic part of it really is, I feel like, a more driving factor in that regard. So hopefully that's what we start to see with AI. Any other questions? All right, well, thank you everyone for your attention. Glad you could come here today. Hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.